The dog started disappearing every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., and at first no one believed it meant anything. Camp Ridgeline slept quietly under a pale desert moon, the long rows of barracks silent except for the distant hum of highway trucks drifting across the dry Arizona air. And most nights Marine Sergeant Lucas Bennett was asleep like everyone else, boots by the door, alarm set for morning drills, his mind trained by years of service to trust routine and ignore small mysteries. But Shadow was not a routine dog. Shadow was a 5-year-old German Shepherd K9 with a sable coat dark as storm clouds along his spine and amber eyes that seemed to hold questions even humans didn't know how to ask. A dog trained for search work, discipline, and loyalty, the kind of partner a Marine trusted with his life. And yet 3 nights in a row Lucas woke to the same quiet sound, the soft metallic click of the kennel latch. The first night he assumed he had forgotten to secure it. The second night, he blamed the wind moving through the chain links outside the barracks. But the third night Lucas opened his eyes to see Shadow already slipping through the doorway, silent as drifting dust, moving with a purpose that did not belong to a restless animal. The digital clock beside Lucas's bunk read 2:17 a.m. The same minute. The same calm, deliberate exit. Lucas sat up slowly, watching the dog disappear into the moonlit yard beyond the barracks window. And something deep in his instincts stirred the way it had on patrol years earlier, when a situation felt wrong even before the evidence appeared. Shadow returned before sunrise every time. That was the strange part. By 5:40 a.m., just before the first bugle echoed across the base, the dog would be back in his kennel, lying down as if he had never left, breathing evenly, eyes closed, the perfect soldier. But there were signs if you knew where to look. Fine dust clung to his paws. Once Lucas noticed damp fur along Shadow's chest, even though the desert air hadn't seen rain in weeks. Another morning, there was the faint smell of city streets on the dog's coat, asphalt and engine oil, a scent that didn't belong anywhere near the quiet perimeter of Camp Ridgeline. Lucas crouched beside the kennel that morning, studying the German Shepherd as Shadow lifted his head and looked back with calm, unreadable eyes. "Where are you going, partner?" Lucas murmured under his breath. The dog blinked slowly, tail resting still against the concrete floor. No bark, no movement, just patience. The kind of patience that made Lucas feel like the dog was waiting for something or someone. Marines learn quickly that patterns mean something. A repeated signal is never an accident. And now Lucas couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. 3 nights. Same time. Same quiet escape. The kind of behavior a trained K9 only showed when following a task. But no one had assigned Shadow a night mission. No orders had been logged. No patrol route scheduled. Which meant only 2 possibilities remained in Lucas Bennett's mind. Either the dog had learned something no one else on base had noticed, or Shadow was carrying out a mission that no human had ever given him. Lucas Bennett did not sleep much the next night. The desert air outside the barracks carried the dry smell of dust and creosote drifting in through the cracked window, and every few minutes he glanced at the dim green glow of the digital clock beside his bunk. Midnight passed slowly. 1 o'clock came and went. The base was quiet except for the distant rattle of a passing freight train somewhere beyond the highway and the low murmur of a generator near the motor pool. Lucas lay still with his boots already laced and his jacket draped over the chair beside him, waiting. When the clock shifted to 2:17 in the morning, the sound came again. A soft metal click. Lucas opened his eyes. Shadow was already standing at the kennel door, nose pressed lightly against the latch. The German Shepherd moved with the calm focus of a trained soldier, pushing the gate open just enough to slip through. For a moment the dog paused in the doorway, ears upright, scanning the hallway as if confirming the world was still asleep. Lucas remained perfectly still on the bunk. Then Shadow stepped outside into the moonlight and disappeared across the yard. Lucas counted to 10 before rising. His boots touched the floor without a sound, and he slipped into his jacket, moving slowly through the dark barracks corridor. The cool desert night wrapped around him as he stepped outside. The base looked different at that hour. The tall floodlights cast long pale shadows across the empty pavement, while rows of parked Humvees rested silently, like patient machines waiting for morning. Lucas spotted Shadow immediately. The German Shepherd was already trotting along the outer fence line, head low, tail steady, following a route that looked practiced rather than random. Lucas kept his distance, about 50 yards behind, careful to stay near the darker edges of the buildings. Years of training made the movement natural. Every step measured, every breath controlled. Shadow reached the chain-link gate near the supply lot and slipped through a narrow gap that Lucas had never noticed before. Beyond the fence stretched a dirt access road leading toward the city lights glowing faintly on the horizon. Lucas slowed as he crossed the gate himself, realizing just how far the dog intended to go. The nearest neighborhood sat nearly 3 miles away. The path ahead wound through open desert scattered with mesquite and low rock formations, the ground pale beneath the moon. Shadow did not hesitate. He moved along the road with quiet confidence, paws leaving faint prints in the powdery dirt, occasionally lifting his nose to the wind as if confirming direction. Lucas followed carefully, the night air cooling his lungs with every step. After nearly 40 minutes, the distant glow of streetlights grew brighter, and the quiet hum of the city replaced the stillness of the desert. Shadow reached the edge of an old industrial district where rusted rail lines crossed cracked asphalt and abandoned warehouses stood in silent rows. The German Shepherd slowed near a narrow alley between 2 brick buildings and finally stopped beside a set of worn concrete steps leading to a boarded doorway. Lucas crouched behind a stack of wooden pallets across the street, watching closely. Shadow lowered his head and sniffed the ground, then carefully set something down that Lucas had not noticed before. A small cloth bundle held gently between the dog's teeth. The German Shepherd nudged it against the bottom step, stepped back, and sat quietly facing the dark doorway, as if waiting for someone inside to answer. Lucas Bennett remained crouched behind the weathered stack of wooden pallets, the rough grain pressing against his sleeve as he studied the quiet scene across the alley. The city at this hour felt half asleep, the distant glow of sodium streetlights humming softly while a faint breeze carried the mixed scents of dust, engine oil, and old brick. Shadow sat perfectly still beside the concrete steps, his posture straight and patient, the cloth bundle resting against the bottom stair like an offering placed with careful intention. Lucas waited, expecting someone to appear at any moment, but the boarded doorway remained silent. Minutes passed. The German Shepherd did not move. His amber eyes remained fixed on the dark entrance, as if he believed someone behind that door could see him through the wood. Lucas checked his watch. 2:38 in the morning. The bundle shifted slightly in the wind, and Lucas leaned forward, squinting to see what the dog had carried all the way from the base. It looked like a piece of cloth tied carefully at the corners, small enough to hold in a single hand. Food, Lucas realized after a moment. Probably something taken from the mess hall earlier that evening. Shadow had brought supplies. The realization settled into Lucas's mind slowly, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. This was not random wandering. The dog was delivering something. After several minutes, the German Shepherd stood and walked forward again, nudging the bundle once more against the door before stepping back. His tail moved slightly, not wagging with excitement, but swaying in a quiet rhythm of expectation. Then a sound came from inside the building. It was faint, barely more than a shuffle of movement behind the boarded frame. Shadow's ears lifted instantly. Lucas felt his pulse rise as well. The dog remained seated, calm but alert, waiting with the quiet discipline Lucas had seen countless times during training exercises. The door did not open, but a narrow gap appeared where one of the boards had warped slightly with age. Through that dark slit a thin hand slowly reached down toward the bundle on the step. Lucas stiffened. The hand moved carefully, almost cautiously, as if the person inside feared the world beyond the doorway. The fingers closed around the cloth bundle and pulled it gently through the opening. Shadow watched the movement without barking, without stepping closer, as though he understood that sudden noise might frighten whoever waited inside. The hand disappeared again into the darkness. For several seconds the alley returned to silence. Then something unexpected happened. The same hand reached out again, this time holding a small metal bowl. It placed the bowl carefully beside the step before retreating inside. Shadow rose immediately. The German Shepherd walked forward with slow respect, lowered his head, and drank the water that had been left for him. Lucas exhaled quietly behind the pallets. The scene unfolding before him felt strangely peaceful, almost ceremonial, like two silent partners following an agreement neither of them had spoken aloud. When Shadow finished drinking, he stepped back from the doorway and sat down again, watching the entrance for another moment. The alley light flickered once above him, casting a soft amber glow across his dark fur. Lucas realized he was witnessing something far more deliberate than he had imagined. Shadow had not simply found someone here. The dog had built a routine, a quiet exchange, a nightly delivery that no one on the base had noticed until now. Lucas Bennett stayed hidden behind the wooden pallets long after the hand disappeared behind the warped board. The alley had returned to stillness, but the moment carried a weight that Lucas could not easily explain. The German Shepherd remained seated near the step, posture calm and steady, watching the doorway as though the person inside still mattered even after the exchange was finished. A cool breeze drifted down the narrow street, rattling a loose sheet of metal somewhere on a distant rooftop. The city lights hummed faintly above the empty road while the smell of old asphalt warmed by the previous day lingered in the air. Shadow eventually stood, stretching slightly before turning away from the doorway. He looked back once more, ears forward, as if making sure the unseen figure behind the door was safe for the night. Then the dog began walking slowly down the alley toward the street again. Lucas waited until Shadow had moved nearly half a block before stepping out from behind the pallets. His boots touched the cracked pavement carefully as he approached the boarded doorway. The concrete steps were worn smooth from years of use, and the small metal bowl that had been set out for Shadow was still resting near the edge of the stair. Lucas crouched beside it and ran his fingers lightly along the rim. The bowl was clean, polished by regular use rather than abandonment. Someone inside that building had been expecting the dog. Lucas glanced at the warped board where the hand had appeared only minutes earlier. The gap between the boards was barely 2 inches wide, just enough space for someone inside to pass small items through without opening the door fully. Whoever lived inside had chosen to remain hidden. Lucas stood quietly for a moment, listening. The building gave off the quiet sounds of an old structure settling into the cool night. A faint shuffle echoed somewhere deeper inside, followed by silence again. Lucas did not knock. Something about the careful routine he had just witnessed told him that the person inside trusted Shadow, not strangers. Instead, he stepped back down the stairs and looked around the alley more carefully. The area had clearly been empty for years. Broken windows stared down from the upper floors of the surrounding warehouses, and faded railroad tracks cut across the far end of the street like rusted scars left behind by a different era. Yet the ground near the steps told a different story. Lucas noticed faint footprints in the dust near the doorway, small and uneven, the kind left by someone moving slowly or carefully. A folded blanket rested against the wall beside the steps, tucked neatly beneath a narrow overhang that shielded it from rain. Lucas felt the quiet realization settle deeper into his thoughts. Someone had been living here for a long time, hidden just a few miles from a busy marine base and an entire city that never seemed to notice. And Shadow had found them. Lucas straightened and looked back toward the street where the German Shepherd had disappeared minutes earlier. The dog had not hesitated when leaving. The route was already memorized, the exchange practiced. That meant this had been happening for weeks, maybe longer. Lucas glanced once more at the silent doorway before turning away and following the faint paw prints Shadow had left behind in the dust. The walk back toward the desert would take nearly an hour, but Lucas no longer felt tired. His mind was too busy assembling the pieces of what he had just witnessed. A trained K-9 slipping out of a military base in the middle of the night. A hidden person inside an abandoned building. And a quiet routine of food and water exchanged under the cover of darkness. By the time Lucas reached the edge of the industrial district again, the eastern horizon had begun to fade from black to a deep shade of blue. Dawn was still nearly an hour away. Lucas knew one thing for certain now. Shadow was not wandering the desert at night. The dog was returning to someone. And Lucas Bennett had only just begun to understand why. Lucas Bennett reached the outer fence of Camp Ridgeline just as the first pale line of dawn began stretching across the eastern desert sky. The walk back from the industrial district had taken nearly an hour, the cool air slowly warming as the night faded into early morning. Shadow was already there waiting beside the narrow gap in the fence, sitting calmly in the sand, as though the entire journey had simply been another routine patrol. When Lucas approached, the German Shepherd rose quietly and slipped through the opening, trotting toward the barracks with the same steady confidence he had shown hours earlier. Lucas followed a few steps behind, studying the dog more carefully now. Every movement looked deliberate. Shadow was not tired. He was not confused. He moved with the calm certainty of a soldier completing a familiar assignment. By the time they returned to the kennel building, the base was beginning to wake. A truck engine started somewhere near the motor pool, and distant voices carried across the training yard as early shift Marines prepared for morning drills. Shadow stepped inside the kennel and settled onto the concrete floor as if nothing unusual had happened. Lucas closed the latch and stood there for a moment watching him. The dog lifted his head and met Lucas's eyes with that same quiet patience. It was almost as if Shadow understood he had been followed and had simply allowed it to happen. Lucas exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. His mind replayed the entire scene from the alley. The cloth bundle, the thin hand reaching through the warped board, the metal bowl placed carefully beside the steps. Whoever lived in that abandoned building had clearly been expecting Shadow. This was not a coincidence. It was a system built on trust. Later that morning, the sun climbed higher above the desert hills, casting sharp golden light across the base as Marines moved through their routines. Lucas sat at a metal table outside the mess hall with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Around him, the familiar rhythm of base life continued. Boots crossed gravel. Orders echoed across the training field. Helicopters droned faintly in the distance. Yet Lucas could not stop thinking about the quiet doorway in that abandoned warehouse district. Someone had been hiding there for weeks, maybe months, surviving in silence, just a few miles from a busy military base and a city of nearly 200,000 people. And the only one who had found them was a German shepherd. Lucas looked down at the ground beside the table where Shadow lay resting in the shade. The dog appeared relaxed, eyes half closed, breathing slow and even. No one watching them would suspect anything unusual. But Lucas now understood that Shadow's nights were not empty. The dog had a destination, a purpose that continued long after the base lights went out. Lucas leaned forward slightly and studied the German shepherd again. "Who is he to you?" Lucas murmured quietly. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of Lucas's voice, but the dog did not open his eyes. For a moment, Lucas wondered if the person inside that building might be someone Shadow had known before arriving at Camp Ridgeline. Perhaps a former handler. Perhaps someone who had once worked with the dog during training. The thought lingered in Lucas's mind throughout the morning. By early afternoon, he had made a decision. If Shadow had built this routine to help someone survive, Lucas needed to know who that person was and why they were hiding. Because whatever secret waited behind that boarded doorway, one thing had become clear. Shadow was not just visiting that alley. The dog was protecting someone the rest of the world had forgotten. That evening, Lucas Bennett did something he had never done before. He watched Shadow more closely than any Marine had ever watched a dog. The sun had dipped behind the distant desert hills, leaving Camp Ridgeline wrapped in the orange glow of fading daylight. The base slowly settled into its nighttime rhythm. Engines went quiet, the last training drills ended, and the long rows of barracks began filling with the low murmur of conversation and distant laughter. But Lucas was not listening to any of it. He sat on the edge of his bunk with his boots already laced and his jacket folded beside him, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the kennel where Shadow rested on the concrete floor. The German shepherd looked calm as always, stretched out comfortably with his head resting on his paws, amber eyes half closed as if sleep was already beginning to take hold. To anyone else, the dog would have appeared completely ordinary. But Lucas now knew better. He had seen the route. He had seen the exchange in the alley. Somewhere inside that quiet animal was a mission no one had ordered. The digital clock beside Lucas's bunk ticked forward slowly. 10:45, 11:30, midnight. Outside, the desert air cooled quickly as the night deepened, carrying the dry scent of sage and sand through the open window. Lucas waited patiently. Marines learn early that patience reveals more than force ever could. When the clock finally changed to 2:17 in the morning, the sound came again. The soft metallic click of the kennel latch opening. Shadow rose smoothly to his feet and nudged the gate open with his nose just as he had done the nights before. For a brief moment the dog paused, ears lifted slightly, listening to the stillness of the barracks hallway. Lucas remained perfectly still in the shadows of the room, watching carefully. Then Shadow stepped out into the moonlit yard beyond the doorway and began trotting toward the outer fence. Lucas stood quietly and followed. The desert sky above them was clear and wide, scattered with stars that glimmered faintly above the distant glow of city lights. The base looked almost peaceful at this hour, long shadows stretching across empty pavement while a light breeze stirred the dust along the training fields. Shadow slipped through the narrow opening in the fence and continued down the dirt access road with the same steady pace Lucas had seen the night before. This time Lucas followed more confidently, keeping about 60 yards behind while staying low along the darker edges of the road. The route unfolded exactly as Lucas remembered. The open desert, the cracked highway crossing, the quiet industrial district waiting beyond the edge of the city. Nearly 40 minutes later, Shadow reached the same narrow alley between the old brick warehouses and slowed as he approached the worn concrete steps. Lucas crouched once again behind the stack of wooden pallets across the street, his eyes fixed on the doorway. Shadow carried another small cloth bundle in his mouth, tied carefully at the corners just like the one from the night before. The German Shepherd placed it gently against the bottom step and sat down to wait. For several long seconds nothing moved. Then the warped board shifted slightly, and the thin hand appeared again through the narrow gap. But this time the hand hesitated before reaching for the bundle. It lingered there for a moment, as if the person inside had sensed something different in the quiet night air. Shadow tilted his head slightly and gave a soft, reassuring huff through his nose, a gentle sound that carried across the silent alley. Only then did the hand move forward and take the bundle. And as Lucas watched the exchange unfold again beneath the flickering alley light, a strange thought crossed his mind. The person behind that door trusted the dog completely. But tonight, for the first time, they might not be alone. Lucas Bennett felt the shift in the air before he understood why. It was not a sound exactly, nor movement, but something subtle that years of training had taught him to notice. The alley seemed to hold its breath. The thin hand that had taken the cloth bundle lingered just inside the narrow gap in the warped board, as if the person behind the door sensed that something had changed in the night routine. Shadow remained seated on the concrete beside the steps, calm and steady, his amber eyes fixed gently on the doorway. The dog gave another soft breath through his nose, a quiet reassurance that carried across the still alley. The hand slowly disappeared again, drawing the bundle inside. For several seconds nothing else happened. Lucas stayed crouched behind the wooden pallets, his shoulders pressed against the rough boards while the yellow alley light flickered above the empty street. Then the warped board shifted again, this time opening slightly wider. A face appeared in the darkness behind it. Lucas could not see clearly at first, only the faint outline of someone peering carefully through the narrow gap. The person looked toward Shadow first, studying the dog with cautious familiarity. Then their gaze slowly moved across the alley until it stopped on the shadowed stack of pallets where Lucas was hiding. Lucas realized in that instant that the person had seen him. The face did not show fear or anger. Instead, it held something quieter, curiosity mixed with hesitation. Shadow followed the movement as well, turning his head slightly before looking back toward Lucas. For a moment, the German Shepherd's eyes met Lucas's across the alley. There was no alarm in them, no warning bark. Only recognition. It was almost as if the dog was acknowledging that Lucas now belonged to the secret he had been protecting. Lucas slowly stood from behind the pallets and stepped into the open street. The cool desert air brushed across his jacket as he walked toward the concrete steps. His boots echoed softly against the cracked pavement. Shadow rose calmly when Lucas approached, but did not move away from the doorway. The person behind the board watched every step Lucas took, their face still partially hidden in the dim light. When Lucas stopped a few feet from the steps, he raised one hand slowly in a quiet gesture of peace. The alley remained silent except for the distant hum of a highway 2 blocks away. For several long seconds no one spoke. Then a voice came from behind the board, low and rough from disuse, but steady. The words were simple. "You followed him." Lucas nodded slightly, glancing down at Shadow before looking back at the narrow opening in the door. "Yes," Lucas answered quietly. The person behind the board studied him for a moment longer, as though weighing a decision that had been waiting for weeks. Then the board shifted again, opening another inch. The light from the alley lamp reached a little farther into the dark doorway, revealing more of the person's face. Lucas noticed the tired lines around their eyes and the pale look of someone who had spent a long time indoors. Shadow stepped forward and gently touched the doorway with his nose, his tail giving a slow, calm sway. The person behind the door reached out and rested a hand briefly on the dog's head. The gesture carried familiarity, not fear, not surprise, the kind of quiet connection that only forms after many shared nights. And in that moment, Lucas Bennett understood something important. Shadow had not simply discovered a stranger hiding in an abandoned building. The dog had found someone he already knew. The alley felt different now that the silence had been broken. Lucas Bennett stood a few feet from the concrete steps, the dim yellow light above the doorway casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Shadow remained beside him, calm and steady, his ears relaxed as the hand from the doorway continued resting gently on the top of the dog's head. The person behind the warped board studied Lucas carefully for several seconds, as if measuring the kind of man who had followed the dog across miles of desert and city streets in the middle of the night. The air carried the faint scent of dust and old brick while a distant truck rumbled somewhere far beyond the empty warehouses. Lucas kept his voice low when he finally spoke. "He has been coming here for a while, has he not?" The person behind the door hesitated before answering. The voice that came through the narrow gap was quiet but clear. "Every night." Shadow's tail moved slowly against the concrete step, the sound soft and rhythmic. Lucas glanced down at the dog for a moment before looking back toward the doorway. The face behind the board shifted slightly into the light, revealing a man who looked older than Lucas had expected, with tired eyes and a beard that had grown uneven over several weeks. The man did not appear dangerous or threatening. Instead, he looked like someone who had simply stepped away from the world for too long. Lucas spoke again, carefully choosing his words. Shadow never told anyone where he was going. The man gave a faint smile that barely showed through the narrow opening. "That sounds like him." For a moment, neither of them said anything more. The quiet of the alley returned, filled only by the low buzz of the flickering lamp above them. Lucas noticed that the man inside the doorway kept one shoulder slightly hidden behind the frame, as if the habit of staying unseen had become natural. After a long pause, the man spoke again. "You are from the base." Lucas nodded once. "Yes." The man's hand slowly moved from Shadow's head to the edge of the doorway, his fingers resting lightly against the worn wood. "He used to belong to someone there," the man said softly. Lucas felt a small shift of understanding begin forming in his thoughts. "Used to?" The man nodded faintly in the dim light. "Before the training unit moved him." Shadow looked up at Lucas briefly and then back toward the man behind the door, as though listening to every word. Lucas studied the dog more closely now. The calm posture, the steady attention, the quiet loyalty that had guided him here night after night. The man behind the door continued speaking, his voice carrying a tired warmth. "He remembered me even after they reassigned him." Lucas felt the pieces slowly connecting inside his mind. This was not just a stranger who had been helped by a passing dog. Shadow had come here because he recognized someone important, someone who had once been part of his life. Lucas leaned slightly closer to the doorway, curiosity now stronger than caution. "Were you his handler?" The man's eyes lowered briefly, and for the first time there was something deeper in his expression than simple exhaustion. There was memory there, and a quiet kind of loss. After a few seconds he answered, "Yes." Shadow stepped forward again and gently pressed his nose against the narrow gap in the door, as if confirming the truth of that word. Lucas watched the moment carefully, realizing that the strange mission he had followed across the desert was not a mystery at all. It was something far simpler. A dog returning to the one person he had never stopped recognizing. Lucas Bennett remained standing in the quiet alley while the word lingered in the air between them. "Handler." The flickering lamp above the doorway buzzed softly, casting uneven light across the worn bricks and the tired face behind the warped board. Shadow stood pressed close to the doorway now, his tail moving slowly as the man inside rested a steady hand against the dog's neck. The gesture was gentle and familiar, the kind that only existed between partners who had once worked side by side. Lucas studied the man more carefully in the dim light. The beard was uneven, the jacket worn thin at the sleeves, but the posture behind the doorway still carried the quiet discipline of someone who had once lived by rules and structure. "What is your name?" Lucas asked calmly. The man hesitated for a moment before answering. "Ryan Keller." The name meant nothing to Lucas at first, but something about the way Shadow responded did. The German shepherd gave a soft breath and leaned closer to the narrow opening in the door, as if the sound of the name confirmed everything the dog already knew. Lucas nodded slowly. You served at the base before. Ryan gave a faint smile that carried both pride and weariness. A long time ago. For a moment he looked past Lucas toward the distant glow of the city lights at the end of the street. Before things got quiet. Lucas understood what that meant without needing the rest explained. Some Marines leave the service with medals and stories. Others leave with memories that make the world feel too loud or too crowded. Ryan continued speaking softly, his hand still resting against Shadow's fur. When they reassigned him to the training unit, I figured he would forget me eventually. Dogs move on faster than people do. Shadow shifted slightly and nudged his nose against Ryan's hand as if disagreeing with the idea. Lucas allowed a small smile to cross his face. He did not forget. Ryan's eyes lowered for a moment as he watched the dog. No, he did not. The alley remained quiet around them, the night air cooling as the first hint of dawn slowly approached somewhere beyond the warehouses. Lucas leaned against the brick wall beside the steps, thinking about the miles Shadow had traveled each night across desert roads and empty streets. He has been bringing you food, Lucas said gently. Ryan nodded once. I never asked him to. Lucas believed that. Dogs like Shadow did not wait for instructions when loyalty was involved. Ryan looked down at the cloth bundle he had taken earlier and then back toward Lucas. I tried leaving once, he said quietly. But the world felt too fast. Too crowded. He paused, glancing again at the dog beside the door. Shadow kept finding me anyway. Lucas followed the movement of the dog's steady breathing and felt the weight of the strange journey that had led him here. This had never been a secret mission given by orders or commands. It had been something much simpler and much stronger. A bond that had refused to break even after the world had changed around it. Lucas finally stepped back from the doorway, giving Ryan and the dog a little more space. The eastern horizon was beginning to fade toward pale blue, signaling that morning would arrive within the hour. The base has room for both of you, Lucas said quietly. Ryan looked uncertain, but Shadow turned his head immediately toward Lucas, ears lifting as if the dog already understood the invitation. Ryan studied the dog for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. For the first time since Lucas had arrived, the door opened slightly wider. And as the early light of dawn crept into the alley, the quiet mission that had been hidden in the night finally began to come to an end.